Hello, once again. This is Brian Hayden, and I'm going to be discussing the languages that might have been spoken in prehistorically in Europe today. So, people sometimes wonder what languages could have been spoken, say, in the Neolithic or Bronze Age or the Upper Paleolithic. So, I'll give you a quick synopsis of what we know. First of all, we need to realize that linguists group languages that are fairly similar into what are called families. Families of languages that have similar words, similar sounds, similar grammatical construction. They're related, like Vater in German and father in English, etc., like that. So, yeah, and what we can determine, what's been known for quite a while now, since even the 1700s, is that most of the languages in Europe are related. And so that's become a very large family. It extends even into India and Persia or Iran, known as the Indo-European language family. And it consists of most of the languages that are spoken today, including all the Slavic languages, the Romance languages, the Celtic languages, the Germanic languages. So that covers a lot of languages. Um, and and this is what was spoken currently. And it's thought in general that these were introduced with a new population that came into Europe with the Bronze Age from the Ukrainian steppes, basically. And they brought bronze and they brought this new suite of languages that diversified and combined with local languages, etc. And so that these are the languages that we're pretty sure were spoken in both the Iron Age, starting around 700 BC, and the Bronze Age, starting around 2500 BC in Europe, and right up until historic times. When we go back a little bit further than that, and I should mention that beyond language families, it's quite difficult to determine relationships between languages. I mean, trying to determine relationships between language families is difficult. Sometimes you get some hints, but for the most part, it's hard to make those relationships. So I should mention too that there is a minority of prehistorians and linguists that do think that the original arrival of Indo-European languages actually occurred in the Neolithic, say starting about 8000 BC, into when the Neolithic groups arrived into Europe from the Middle East. So that's a minority opinion, and there's a possibility that that was the case, but most people think that these languages, Indo-European languages, arrived with the Bronze Age. So the Neolithic, it's a little bit more difficult to tell what languages they spoke, probably related to Neolithic language families, because that's where most of the domesticates come from. The wheat and the rye and the barley, as well as the sheep and goats and pigs were already here. But at any rate, the sheep and the goats largely came from the Near East, and that's fairly well documented. But what language the Neolithic groups spoke is more difficult to determine. So when they arrived, they displaced in most places the native populations, the hunting and gathering populations that had been resident in Europe during the Mesolithic and the Upper Paleolithic. We don't see much change in populations from the Upper Paleolithic to the Mesolithic, but there were probably these hunting and gathering populations were probably driven out of the best agricultural areas, and they took refuge in marginal areas like way up north and up into the mountainous areas that were not very good for agriculture. So what we have in Europe are a number of non-Indo-European languages. And these may be some of the languages that were spoken either in the Neolithic, or people often think that they were spoken in the Upper Paleolithic as well, or could be related to them, descendant from them at least. So there are four of these, basically four non-Indo-European languages in Europe. And these include the Sami, way up north in Scandinavia, in Finland and northern Norway and northern Sweden. They include the Basque regions in the Pyrenees Mountains between France and Spain. And they include Hungarian, which was brought in by the Tartars in medieval times. And they include Etruscan, which the Romans basically overtook the Etruscan area and demanded that everybody speak Roman. So that Etruscan is only known in fragments. It's an extinct language today, so we don't know a lot about it. And so we can't really consider that for our language history here, or trying to understand what was spoken before the Neolithic or before the Bronze Age. And the Hungarian is obviously a very recent arrival, so that's not going to tell us much about the distant past, say in the Neolithic or Upper Paleolithic. So that leaves Basque and Sami. And the Sami language is part of another very large language family called Finno-Ugric. And that goes from northern Scandinavia right across the Siberian steppes into Mongolia. So it's a huge language family. Hungarian is part of that as well. And it's sometimes thought or proposed that since the Sami are reindeer hunters, that they may have been the original occupants of Europe and hunted reindeer in the Upper Paleolithic, say 10 or 12,000 to 35,000 years ago. And that and Europe then was grassland, basically, and that as the glaciers melted at the end of the Ice Age 12,000 years ago, the glaciers retreated, the grasslands went north, a forest covered the parts of, well, most of Central Europe, and therefore it didn't support reindeer or other dense kinds of animals that fed on grass, so that the populations of the Upper Paleolithic followed the reindeer going north, further and further north until they reached northern Scandinavia, and that the Sami reindeer hunters are basically the same populations as descended populations as the Upper Paleolithic. So that's one scenario. On the other hand, it's possible that that did happen, but that Finno-Ugric speakers from central Siberia and further east migrated into the area of northern Scandinavia and replaced any of the native or the original Upper Paleolithic hunters and gatherers that were there. And so that's a possibility, but it's hard to tell. So that leaves the Basques, and the Basques are thought to be a refuge kind of population from hunting and gathering groups in Central Europe, in particular in southwestern France. And in the story about Sèvres in The Eyes of the Leopard, that takes place in southwestern France, and Basque is the closest area to that might be might have been speakers of descendant Upper Paleolithic languages. And so in order to add a little bit more realism to the story, I used Basque names for a lot of the characters. For instance, Urtzi means sky, and Lorea means flower, and Izar means star, and Ekain means summer, and there are a number of other characters that have Basque names. So I hope it adds a little bit more realism and enjoyment to the reading of the story about Sev in the Eyes of the Leopard when you get around to reading that. So that's it for today, and I hope that's provided a little bit of insight into what languages were spoken prehistorically in Europe. Take care. Bye.